Is it so strange to open a box on your doorstep? It was addressed to me, and that means it was mine. Of course I would open it. I didn't even notice that it had no return address. It was just a small package wrapped in a brown paper. My name was written so perfectly in dark black marker. It was for me. Anyone else would have done the exact same thing. The box held two things: the DVD and a small wooden figure. It was a bear. Without waiting, I put the DVD in my computer. I put the tiny bear on the table beside me. The DVD had a small menu with 4 chapters. The chapter names were Origin, Cast, Helen Asks to Leave the Table, and Overture. I clicked on the Origin chapter. Origin starts with the words "Start" flashing on the screen. That lasts for a few moments before it switches to a forest scene. The person holding the camera walks slowly through the woods. The only sounds are those of nature. Sometimes I could hear breathing, but it seemed too quiet to be from the cameraman. After spending 5 minutes walking through the woods, the person comes across a house. Maybe it was more like a shack? The structure has a dirty wire fence around it with an open gate. The person circles the house 4 times. There was one window on the west and one on the east walls. You could almost see a woman inside. She was not moving. The camera was held very carefully. There was very little shaking or distortion. After the last circle, the cameraman pans to the trail they just came from. The sounds of crunching leaves can be heard. This clearly scares the cameraman. They run behind the house to hide. The video moves as if it was going to show the cameraman's face, but it abruptly cuts out, leaving the following numbers written in yellow and black on the screen. 43.184094. -89.627.832. Then I was taken back to the main menu. I tried to click on the Origin chapter again, but it was crossed out with a yellow X. I realized then that the little bear had fallen over on its side. I righted it and clicked on the next chapter. Cast begins to play with footage of black trash bags. They look as though they were used. The video then switches to a kitchen. A woman in a green dress has her back to the camera. She is stirring something on a stove. Faintly, I could hear her sniffling. Something comes pounding down the stairs off camera. A child is crying. The woman doesn't react to either of these sounds. The camera is suddenly picked up by someone. This cameraman is much less careful with the camera. They turn away from the woman and instead focus on a young girl. She is on her knees on the kitchen floor, her hands folded as if in prayer. A book is being held between her arms and chest. Her head has been shaved except one odd chunk that hangs almost completely off her face. No one in the scene is disturbed by the little girl. The footage moves down to show another child, a boy at the feet of the cameraman. He is the one crying. The camera person kicks the boy in the stomach. Then in the first audible dialogue on the DVD, the cameraman says,
"You forgot to face your father."
The voice is an adult man. The boy crawls desperately toward the girl. He grabs at her clothes. He does not speak in words, but seems to be trying to get the girl's attention. She ignores him. The man speaks again. "Do as you're told, or what you're told will be done to you." The boy looks helplessly into the camera. He finds no solace there. Slowly he scuttles up onto his knees. She takes the book she was holding and puts it delicately on the boy's head. He must now balance so that the book doesn't fall. I tried to see the title of the book, but I could only make out "The Dark Blank Slinger." The boy begins to whisper. The girl kisses him on the mouth and then resumes her own prayers. The footage pans back to the woman, who has since removed her dress and stands naked in the kitchen. Her back is covered with scars. 3 of her fingers are missing on the right hand. The cameraman approaches her and with a black-gloved hand strokes her injured spine. The woman keeps stirring whatever is on the stove. The man places the camera down on the counter. All I could see was the woman's midsection. The man behind the camera steps into view. He is wearing a long jacket and has a machete in his gloved hand. He presses the blade on the woman's skin. The scene cuts away before anything else can happen. On a black screen, these letters appear in bright yellow. JUNG space VS space LBHE space SNGURE space UNF space AB space SNPR. The main menu comes back suddenly. I wanted to be done watching, but the next chapter loaded without me clicking on it. The bear had fallen over again, but I didn't pick it up this time. I felt stuck in place. Helen asks to leave the table. Had the oddest title of all chapters, and possibly the most disturbing footage. There was no opening the way the other two chapters began. Instead, it starts at a table. The camera sits upon it, staring at an empty chair. The room is dark, but not completely black. The light flickers as if lit by candles. Nothing makes a sound except labored breathing which comes from people off screen. It stays like this for almost 10 minutes. I couldn't look away. Finally, a man begins singing tunelessly. It's Hey Jude by the Beatles. He sings almost angrily, accusingly. The man's torso comes into view as he picks up the camera. He turns the lens to the rest of the scene. There are 3 people sitting around the table. I assumed they were the characters from the previous chapter. Each is wearing a black trash bag over their head. The bag has been cut so some air can come in and out. Even so, the wearers seem to be having a hard time breathing. The plastic presses tight against their faces before being blown out as they are exhaled. In front of each person is an empty plate. In the center of the table is a dead raccoon. It looks like it had been dead for a long time. Maggots had eaten out its eyes. The man walks around the table, snatching the bags off of each person's head in vicious thrusts. The first bag was of the young girl. She gulps air in like a drowning victim. She has a black eye now. Her small chunk of her hair is stuck on her nose and mouth. She does not move it away. Maybe she can't. The next bag removed is of the woman. She does not react except to blink quickly. Her neck is cracked at an odd angle. There are bits of dried blood around her mouth. She does not look at the man or the little girl. The last bag is of the young boy. His eyes are open, but skin is sallow. It's unclear whether or not he is breathing at all. The man circles back to the head of the table. He sits, placing the camera in front of him. He has stopped singing. Instead, he lets out a loud laugh and says, "A family that eats together stays together. Aren't we a family?" No response, which angers the man.
Well, aren't we?
The little girl squeaks. "Yes, John. Dad. A family, a perfect family." The woman and young boy do not respond. The man seems satisfied.
Feast, then.
The woman and little girl stand. They descend upon the raccoon. It is revealed that both of their hands are tied behind their backs. They shove their faces into the carcass, tearing and eating with desperate hunger. The boy does not move. He hasn't blinked. The man hums Hey Jude as they eat the raccoon. They swallow the maggots along with the raw meat. This disgusting banquet goes on for well over 15 minutes. At one moment, a bone flies and hits the boy in the temple. He doesn't react. The bone strikes his face and then lands on his lap. The man eventually pounds his fist against the table. The woman and the girl tear themselves away from what's left of the raccoon. Blood and pus cover their faces. The man stands up and walks over to the girl. He looks like he's trying to clean her up, but instead lingers sickeningly long on her budding chest. His gloved hands cover her face and body. He then leans over and kisses the back of her head. She shuts her eyes tight. The woman vomits on the table. This distracts the man, who runs over and slaps her in the face.
You are ruining our family dinner.
For the first time, she stares back at him defiantly. "Leave her alone."
She's my daughter,
he says carefully. The woman goes to respond, but the man grabs her by her hair and slams her face into the table. He does so 7 times. Blood covers the wood and the table. The man then throws her onto the floor and takes the camera.
Ungrateful, ungrateful, Ungrateful.
he repeats.
What happens to sinners who are ungrateful? What happens to ungrateful women? What happens to women?
During this time, no one has realized that the little girl shrank away from the table. The last cut of footage is of the young boy, clearly dead for a few days, laid upon an altar. There is a large statue of the Virgin Mary behind the boy. The face of the statue seems to be the same face seen in the window of the structure for the first chapter. The chapter ends and the main menu began flashing. At this point, I could not move. I looked down and realized my hands were tied with the same rope of the woman in the video. I called out for help, but something was in my mouth. I coughed up small wooden bear onto the table before me. The next chapter began playing. Overture begins with a yellow and black stripe screen. The yellow saturates the black until the screen is completely yellow. The video then cuts to a man called John by the little girl. He is speaking into the camera in a fast pace. Most of what he says makes no sense. There are themes of family throughout, but otherwise has no obvious connections. At one point he says he has no family, then quickly jumps back to the family he does have, or has created. The entire time he holds a book in his hands. The book is bent so that I could not see the title, but there is definitely a gun on the cover. The man even uses the book to pretend to shoot himself.
Dead dad. Dead dad. Dad is dead. Wants to be dead. My family wants a dad, but wants a dad dead.
After 10 minutes of rambling, he pulls out a chunk of wood and begins biting it. With the wood in his mouth, he reaches below him and pulls out a hand connected to an arm off screen. A hand with only 2 fingers left on it. The last footage is similar to the first chapter, except the person is running. They run through the woods urgently. Once they come to a small house in the first chapter, the cameraman drops the camera. This distorts the image. My laptop went completely black at this point. What the hell? I hear myself say out loud. I look down at my hands and realize they're no longer tied together. They probably never were. The little bear is upright and sitting where I had originally put it. I was able to eject the DVD and close my laptop. Without hesitation, I broke the DVD in half. I might have been able to move past this. I opened a box with my name on it, watched a DVD meant for me, and it was over now. I might have been able to move on, but there was another box on my porch this morning. This one was wrapped in a black trash bag. This package was not addressed to me, not like the last one. It was a DVD thrown in a black trash bag. The bag was wet, as if it had been outside for a long time. The ties were open. I brought it in the house and fished inside. After I found the DVD, I pulled out the second item. A rose. Except it wasn't a rose. It was a picture of a rose drawn on construction paper. The edges had been ripped or nibbled off. Perhaps it had been drawn by a child. With robotic movements, I took the DVD and put it in my computer. I propped the rose drawing up beside me. I tried to find the bear, but it was gone. Maybe he scampered away. Maybe I swallowed him. I looked for a good 10 minutes, and the rose never fell over. I don't know why I did it. I could have left the bag outside, and I could have ignored it. But something about the way the light caught the black of the plastic, shining back at me like eyes in a deep and endless ocean. It made me do it. My actions were predetermined. It was like the bag knew I would pick it up and reveal its contents. It had already moved on. The DVD started with a menu, just like the last one. The chapters were Father, Helen Shakes a Leg, Choo-choo, Helen and Margaret Are Okay, and Mother. I stared at the screen for a while. I was too afraid to click the first chapter, despite my body calling out for it. But in the end, the DVD made the decision. It started playing without me clicking anywhere. The first chapter, called Father, begins with a black screen and giggling. It sounds like a young girl. In a whispered voice, she says, "I stole John's camera. Won't you be mad?" And then more giggling. Suddenly the black was ripped away, revealed to simply be a shirt thrown over the lens. The little girl from the first video was gazing at the camera. She has 2 black eyes. Her bottom lip was slightly torn. She wears a basic dress with one huge pocket on her stomach. She stops laughing, and looks as if she's going to cry. She rubs her eyes furiously despite the pain it must cause her. She turns her back to the camera and sits down. There are a few seconds of silence. Slowly she lifts one finger over her shoulder. The rest of her hand and arm are not in sight. She bends her finger up and down. In a strange high voice she says, "Hello, I am Yesterday." In her regular voice she responds, "Hello, Yesterday. I am lonely. Will you be my friend?" The finger wags and says, "No, you are ugly." "Please?" The finger stands up straight. It quivers for a second. "Ugly girls get devil grass and bruises." "I'll be your friend," cries a new voice. The girl has lifted her other finger over her right shoulder. "I love you, daughter. You are no demon. You are a clean baby girl." The left finger angrily asks, "Who are you?" "I am her father." "John is her father." "John smells bad. He cannot be a father." The fingers argue with each other in strange little voices while the girl sits still. The left finger even begins flicking her in the head, but she does not react. "Don't hit her," wails the right finger. "She is my little mouse." The left finger shouts, "She has forgotten the face of her father." "Her father has no face," screams the right. A crash is heard off screen. The little girl scrambles up and runs to the camera. She tries to turn it off quickly, but before the shot ends, I can see the man called John striding into the room. He wears a thick black belt that he touches firmly. The girl gasps before the scene cuts to black. In a big yellow font are the words, "And be a happy little girl, until the day I die." The main menu returns. My hands are tickling. It felt like they itched. The rose had begun to smell. It was sweet, like a real flower. I breathed it in. For some reason it turned to smoke in my throat. I coughed and scratched at my neck. Before I had completely gotten the ash out of me, the next chapter began to play. Helen shakes a leg. It is the most graphic video I've ever seen. It starts with a woman, the same from the previous DVD, strapped to a table. It looks like the same dining room table that they had eaten the raccoon off of. She is tied down with belts. She fights against them, but it's no use. The camera person walks around the room to show the woman from every angle. Also in the shot is a large machete and an iron. The woman does not scream. She just stares at the camera defiantly. She whispers something that might be candlestick. Finally, the camera person sets the thing down facing the woman. As I expected, the camera person reveals himself to be John. I can only assume the woman on the table is Helen. Somehow, John has always managed to keep his face out of frame. This scene is no different. John picks up the machete. Helen turns her face away in fear or hatred. He approaches her and rubs the dull side of the blade against her skin. I can almost feel her disgust. John clears his throat and says, "Say it." Helen does not respond. John grips the machete harder. "If you say it, it will make this easier on you." Helen twists her face towards him and spits. From the direction, I think it must have gotten in his face. John wipes away her saliva and lifts the machete above his head. His body shakes.
"I do not aim with my eye!"
He screams as he brings the blade down upon her leg. Helen screams as blood splatters across the room. John lifts the weapon again.
"Do not cut with my hand!"
He swipes downward and slashes her deeper. I swear I could hear when the knife hit the bone. Helen weeps. John is smiling, dripping red.
"I do not kill!"
He cracks the machete on her leg again, nearly severing it. I wanted to look away, but I was not in control of my body. John drops the weapon and descends on the leg. He uses his foot to try to break the bones. Helen is passed out. Drool falls from her lips, mixing on the floor with her blood. He twists the leg until it comes off. He throws the limb away from him and picks up the iron. He sticks his hand in the wound for a second, letting the viscera collect in his palm. Then he presses the iron to the hole, cauterizes the wound. You can nearly smell the cooking flesh. John hums a song, pleased with himself. The last shot is of a yellow screen with small black text. 40.7330 N 74.0071 W. Rose was gone. I didn't bother looking for it. I vomited onto my lap. It smelled like flowers. I tried to get up and clean myself, but I was stuck. There was a belt around my waist, tying me to the chair. It had a holster that was empty. No, not empty. It had a real rose inside of it. Choo-choo begins playing without warning. Luckily, it was a quick chapter. It was just an image of a tiny house from the origin chapter. It fast-forwards through 2 days of footage, showing the shack in day and night. I managed to capture a screenshot of the structure. After the 2 days are complete, the main menu returns. Now, however, the structure stands in the background of the screen. It won't leave. It won't be forgotten. I tried to move again, the belt was gone. The vomit was gone too. Maybe I'd imagined it? The real rose that had been in the holster was now on the table. I reached out to touch it. A thorn pricked my finger. The blood was yellow. It dripped onto the table, onto my computer, onto my legs. Helplessly I looked up as the next chapter played. Helen and Margaret are okay. Starts with Helen in a wheelchair. Except it's not a wheelchair. It's a regular kitchen chair with 2 large cardboard circles taped to the outside. She is either unconscious or extremely out of it. She leans to one side, almost falling off, with her eyes open and tired. Both of her legs have been removed. The little girl sits on her lap. I assume this means the girl is named Margaret. She has a full head of hair in this video, unlike the others. So this must have taken place at a later time. How much later, I can't say. John holds up the camera, like usual. He asks, "How are you?" Margaret replies, "I'm okay, John." "What did you say?" "Dad. I'm okay, Dad." John clucks his tongue, but does not move. "And you?" Clearly he is addressing Helen, who cannot even lift her neck. "Yes, good," he says as if Helen had said something. John steps back. I can see the rotting carcasses of Helen's legs in the corner of the room. John proclaims, "I have a surprise for you." He turns and in front of him is a large door. "We are going through the door today," he says happily. Margaret chirps, "Are we really?" "Oh yes, we are going through the door. We are going to go through the door. The door's the door for other doors. No doors, no mores." John has begun babbling like he did in the previous chapter. He turns, and I could see Margaret's face falling. She knows he will not let them out. "Door floor, more core, bore store, door store. Bought a door at the store. Got to get Jake from the store. No door to where he went." Margaret gets off Helen's lap. She approaches John. "Jake is dead," she tells him matter-of-factly. John drops the camera to the ground, and I could hear him let out a sob. "I didn't want him to." "I know." Margaret picks up the camera now. She focuses on John's face. It is covered by a thick black ski mask. Even if Margaret wanted to show his face, it was covered. "John, why do you record us?" He looks at her for a moment. "Record, cord, door, got to get the door." Margaret lets out a long sigh and turns the camera off. I wanted it to be over. I wanted to shut off my computer. But now it was covered in scorpions. A little bear had returned and was roaring next to me. Roses enclosed the floor. I heard 5 gunshots from somewhere. Started crying. Why was this being sent to me? What had I done that was so terrible? Did I deserve this? The last chapter was called Mother. The footage opens on a plastic gun on the floor. Slowly, Helen crawls into frame. Her movements are weary. She is dirty and naked. The stumps that were once her legs scratch across the wood. Every inch looks painful. She slithers as close to the camera as possible and begins to whisper into it. "Please kill me. Please, kill me." She takes the plastic gun in her mouth. She pulls the trigger, but obviously nothing happens. She pulls it again and again. Tears well up in her eyes. She changes the gun's positions to her forehead. But of course it does nothing. "I want to die," she says a bit louder. "It would be better for me to die." A light comes on from somewhere in the room. Margaret says, "Why do you want to die?" Helen stares at the camera. In the smallest whisper possible, she says, "I'm pregnant." "What?" Margaret calls out from her spot across the room. "Nothing," Helen says louder. "Go find John and tell him he left his camera on." The scene ends. I blinked and my computer was shut down. There were no scorpions. The drawing of the rose was still propped up on the table. The little bear was next to me, harmless. I looked to my finger, but found no cut. Desperately, I tried ejecting the DVD, but there was no DVD. Nothing was inside. I kept pushing the button, hoping to make sense of all this. I heard a sound behind me. My body froze. The blood barely moved in my veins. It was a small beep. Just a tiny everyday noise. Just the sound of something small being turned on. Something like a camera. I was terrified to turn around. After witnessing the horrors on the DVDs, I feared that anything could be behind me. But I felt something like spiders along my skin. My head moved without permission. I slowly twisted, terrified of what I would see. I shut my eyes. Maybe if I didn't look, it couldn't hurt me. I tried as hard as I could to keep my eyes shut, but they were deliberately pulled open. My own fingers were the one to force the lid apart. I hadn't even felt my arms move. When I could see properly, it was almost a relief. There was no one behind me. I had gotten into my head that a crazed John would be standing there, ready to enact his torture upon me. Luckily, that was just a fantasy. I stood. It was impossible not to shiver. I was exhausted. After watching those disturbing videos, I felt almost as if I'd gone through them myself. Maybe a meal or some water would help. But before I could even go, I noticed something out of the ordinary. On the bookcase behind the table, there was a camera. It was sitting innocently between two of my favorite books. I don't remember owning a camera. And there was a small red blinking light on the top. From somewhere in my memory, I recognized this as meaning it needed its battery changed. I approached the camera as though it were a wild animal. When I lifted it, the weight surprised me. It was dull, black, and thoroughly used and dented, but it worked. It was losing power, but it had been recording. It was set up perfectly to view my back, the table, and my computer. I brought the camera closer to my chest, and it immediately died. The screen was blacker than anything I had seen. I saw myself in the darkness. I needed to move on. I needed to put the camera down and get out of there. But I couldn't. I wasn't ready. Or was it that I wasn't able? I sat back down at the table. Instinctively, I knew how to eject the memory card from the camera. It popped out and lay in my palm. I knew then that this was the third video I had to watch. It wasn't a DVD. It hadn't truly been delivered to me, but this is what I had to watch next. I put the memory card into the slot on my computer. It prompted up a folder on the screen. I clicked it. I clicked to open it, but instead it opened a strange folder on my desktop. The folder was Ka, and there were 3 subfolders: Prisoner, Luck, and Death, in that order. I tried to click the Prisoner folder, but it wouldn't open. The same thing happened with Luck. The Death folder opened without issue. Within, there were 3 video files: The Man in Black, The Door, and Margaret is Not Margaret. The Man in Black begins with running. Margaret runs across the room. She is screaming in almost an inhuman voice. The camera person is trying to catch her. They follow her from room to room, getting closer and closer. In one sickening shot, she looks behind her shoulder and her face is one of pure terror. This was the first time I really saw Margaret's fear. Finally, Margaret trips over a rug. The camera person is upon her instantly. She cries and struggles, but is held down. It doesn't take long for the camera to fall beside the pair. As expected, it is John on top of her. He's still wearing his ski mask and gloves. It becomes clear that John is just holding her down. He doesn't try to hurt her or anything else more sinister. Margaret fights like her life depends on it, And there are 3 solid minutes of her fighting. Like the other videos, I couldn't look away. It was difficult to watch, but I was stuck. It was like I had my own John holding me in the chair. Finally, Margaret calms down. She looks into his face, and they stare at each other like strangers. Margaret starts to laugh. She is racked with laughter in the same way she was racked with sobs just minutes earlier. Her body rattles with the sound she makes.
John doesn't let go.
He says,
You've forgotten the face of your father.
She bends upward, pushing her face toward his. He has no face, John. You know that. John is clearly angered by this.
He has a face. A strong face. Face, place to where face was faced.
Show me then. She lays back against the floor. Show me my father's face, John. John sits up, crossing his arms. He is mouthing words, but nothing makes sense. Margaret does not seem surprised by this odd behavior. Maybe he had done this before. Maybe he had often mouthed unintelligible words at her as though they were having a conversation. Margaret lets him do this for a few minutes, with a look of glee and rage. Then she realizes her arms are free. John is no longer holding her down. With a strong hand, she thrusts upward and grips the ski mask. Before John knows what is happening, Margaret has grabbed the ski mask and thrown it across the room. This is when I realized Margaret's previous words were absolutely true. John had no face. Of course, he does have a face. There is something holding his eyes in. There is a resemblance of nostrils and a gaping hole of a mouth, but his entire head is covered in horrible burns. His face is made up of scar tissue that was twisted and crumpled like dull red roots. He had no eyebrows or lips, just disgusting flesh mounds around his teeth, of which he has very few. Panicked, John dives off Margaret and runs to get the mask. Margaret gets to her feet in seconds. She grabs the camera and begins running. She runs through the house and gets to the front door. She tries the doorknob, but it won't budge. Margaret screams at the door and turns to try somewhere else, but suddenly there was John blocking her way. Margaret lets out a small, terrified shriek and drops the camera. The scene turns to yellow before ending. I wanted to stop. Any normal person would call the police, get out of the house, or at least delete the files. I was inexplicably tied to the suffering of Helen and Margaret. Revoltingly, I was also drawn to the madness of John. Maybe I was mad too. My hand tapped the mouse to start the next video. The door starts with the picture of the small structure from the first video. It flashes and distorts, switching quickly to John talking into the camera. He's in the house with Helen. Helen's stomach gets large and it looks clear that she's pregnant. There's something odd sitting on her belly. It looks like a jawbone. John circles Helen, who stares at the ground. She has given up hope. The anger and rage I saw in previous tapes had been replaced with hopelessness. John zooms in on her stomach and the jawbone. The stubs of her legs are also visible. It seems like John wants to show Helen off. John says,
Say it.
Helen clicks her lips. Dada? She replies,
No, the whole thing.
She starts to cry quietly. Dada chum, she says sadly. John makes small, happy noises.
Now raise your claws.
Helen slowly raises her arms in the air. For the first time, her underarms are visible. Both have identical tattoos of a key. The key was crude, with an S shape at the end. She holds her hands up until John grunts. She drops her arms to her sides. In a quiet, sad voice, she asks, Why don't you just kill me? John zooms out on the scene. Margaret is creeping in the backyard, but neither adults notice her.
I don't kill with my gun.
Please, Johnny, I can't do this, she begs.
You just haven't moved on yet.
He responds. He is calm, her Her desperation has almost no effect on him. Helen picks up the jawbone and studies it. Then, like a lightning strike, she stabs herself in the neck. John screams and drops the camera. The bone sticks out of Helen's neck like a stray hair. She sputters, blood filling her windpipe. John is panicking. He pulls the bone out as quickly as possible, but this just causes more blood loss. Helen is smiling. John calls out,
Girl, come here. Help!
I assume he was referring to Margaret, but Margaret does not come. John scrambles for a second before calling her again, yet she does not arrive. Reluctantly, John leaves Helen to go find Margaret. The screen is filled with Helen gradually bleeding out. She coughs on her own blood, but looks content. Helen looks right at the camera. She tries to say something, but it's hard to make out since the fluid was overcoming her mouth and throat. But she might have said, "Joke's on you." Margaret creeps into the room behind Helen. She briefly touches her hair. It is the touch of deep love. Margaret's face is full of regret. She picks up the camera, whispering, "Pleasant nights," before leaving the room. She walks quietly around the house until she reaches the front door. It is open. John is outside, screaming, yelling for the girl. She sneaks through the doorway. Crouching, she circles behind the house and then she takes off running. The camera bounces as she sprints away. John's long scream can be heard in the background. Margaret breathes heavily. The scene cuts between the structure and footage of her running. The sun moves in the sky. Margaret runs with the energy of someone who might never run again. Finally, the scene switches to the footage from the very first video, Origin. Now it is clear that Margaret is the one holding the camera, walking around the structure with the altar inside. There is a crunch from behind her, and she hides. After a few moments, the scene is cut abruptly. The video is over. Instead of relief, panic drenched my body. I was trying to understand what happened. Did Margaret escape? Where was she anyway? Who was Helen and John to her? How did she get there? My fingers shook. And where is she now? I would find out as the next video began to play. Margaret is not Margaret. It is completely different than the rest of the videos. It is not shot by a handheld camera in a creepy house. Instead, it is a clip of a talk show. It looks like it had been shot in the early 2000s, and the host is a warm older man who closes his eyes when he talks. A round of applause begins the video. The man is sitting in a comfortable chair with a much less comfortable one across from him. He smiles as the clapping stops. He leans forward and puts his hands together. "Today, we are meeting a very special girl," he solemnly says. "A girl who has gone through more than any person, let alone a little girl, should ever go through. Her identity has been obscured for many years to protect her from her assailant. However, now that she has turned 18, she wants to tell her side of the story." The man stood. "Please join me in welcoming Tabitha." The audience erupts in applause. Slowly, someone enters the stage. She is a small woman with short cut hair. She walks with a bit of a limp. Her dress is plain. If you walked by her, you would never notice her. But with the giant lights shining down upon her tiny frame, she is exposed. She turns her face instinctively away from the camera. It takes her entirely too long to cross the set and sit in the chair. I reached my hand up and touched the screen. The woman looked so familiar. She had the same eyes as Margaret. In fact, the more I stared, there was no doubt this was Margaret as a grown-up. But there was something else I recognized, something too close to admit. The man on screen moves to hug Tabitha, but she shrinks back. He adapts quickly and sits in his chair. The applause stops. He looks pityingly at Tabitha. "Welcome, my dear." She nods her head, but says nothing. The man compensates. "We're so happy to have you with us to share your story. All of us remember the Indian Lake Maniac. It had a huge impact not only on Wisconsin, but on the entire country. The man called John, whose identity could never be verified, tortured and terrified you and your mother for years. Tell us, how did you survive this?" Tabitha raises her voice. Her voice was not hesitant. It sounded like Margaret's voice. I separated myself from what was happening around me. What do you mean by that? Probes the host. It was still me, but I was also far away. Maybe I was walking on the beach or sleeping under the stars, but I knew my body was there, and my real brain was there. She takes a breath. I was locked in that house, but my imagination could wander anywhere I wanted. That's so brave, the man responds. Some people in the audience start to cry. Others hug each other. Tabitha sees them but doesn't seem to understand their behavior. The host continues. What exactly did John do to you? Tabitha stiffens. Why do you want to know that? The man clears his throat. The man clearly is not prepared for the odd woman. Maybe a better question would be, how did you escape? Tabitha smiles, finally. He called her Helen, not her real name. I don't remember her real name. The world has moved on, but before it moved on, we hatched a plan. She was pregnant with my second little brother. The first, John killed. But the second, my mother killed, she told me. She said, when you hear John yell, you hide. You find that secret place and hide from him. Then when he opens the door to look for you, you run across the beam and get out. Keep running. Run until you don't have legs anymore. That's what she said. That's what I did. The host begins to talk, but Tabitha interrupts him. I made it to the beam, and I ran. I ran all the way to where he left Jake, and that's what he called him, Jake. I don't remember his real name. His body was gone, but I could still smell him. He mutated into something different. He was in the ground now. I hid behind the chapel until John was gone. I stayed there for days. A man and a woman found me. I was almost dead. Almost gone too. Almost with my little brother. They told me I was lucky they found me. They made me go over everything he did in detail. They poked my body in the same places he did. And then they forgot about me. Like I said, the world moved on. The man is speechless. Tabitha doesn't care. He called me Margaret, but I won't let him name me. Giving something a name gives it power. I had a name before the world moved on, but that wasn't me either. So I named myself. Margaret died at Indian Lake. She died just as much as my mother, just as much as my brother, and just as much as Shardik the bear, and the rest. The host waits a few moments before putting on his fake smile. He turns to the camera. We'll be right back with Tabitha, the only survivor of the Indian Lake Maniac. The footage stops on a close-up of Tabitha's face. If you look closely, you can see an odd-looking eye tattooed on her collarbone. The video then goes to black. I could barely breathe. I touched my own collarbone. There, under my skin, lay my own tattoo. It was the same odd-shaped eye in red ink. It came to me in a dream, or so I thought. I blinked and felt woozy. I hadn't eaten all day. This was normal. I was used to going many hours without eating, but at the moment, I felt close to passing out. My small apartment was growing even smaller, and I noticed the clutter for the first time. My chest hurt. All of a sudden, the memory card activated. There was one file on it. It opened without me touching it. The footage made me gasp. It was of me, in the back of my head. I was doing something on my computer, and there was a brown paper bag next to me, some scotch tape, and a large black marker. After a few minutes, I ejected something from the computer, and it was a DVD. Carefully, I pulled out the wooden bear from my pocket and wrapped them both in brown paper. With care, I wrote my name on the front. Tabitha. I put in another DVD to burn. While I was working, I started to draw. I awkwardly created a rose on a piece of construction paper. When the DVD was ready, I threw both in a black trash bag. I put the bag under the table and the package in my arms. I then stood and turned to the camera. I smiled into the lens, leaning forward, lips almost touching. I whispered, "Warm day and pleasant nights." Then I turned the camera off. An odd sensation washed over me. I felt like I had seen that footage before. How long had I been sitting at this table? My apartment felt foreign. I wanted to leave, but before I could, I took the camera and put the memory card back into it. I reached into my pocket and found not the bear, but rather a pair of batteries. I placed them in the camera, turned it on, and put it back between my two favorite books, on Writing and Song of Susanna. I stumbled towards the door, eager to get some fresh air, and I had to leave this place. And I ran across the floor. When I opened it, a small package lay on the porch. I paused for a moment. I had forgotten why I even come to the door in the first place. I picked up the box and took it inside. Is it so strange to open a box on your doorstep? It was addressed to me, and that means it was mine. Of course I would open it.